I think we are now assembled, one or two last people coming through the door. Jacek has quite clearly explained to me that it's our human right to arrive when we wish and leave when we wish. And this is all about human rights and legislation as chosen by the organizers of the event. On the door it says cases of. And indeed, if you have read the literature, you will see that it's about having a conversation about it, showing how people have been inspired to do particular things and particular cases to enliven the participation by legal means to have things done, which will really be difficult to do. Now, we've lost one speaker, alas, because her father died yesterday and she didn't feel quite up to coming, and we've sent our very best wishes to her and her family. I think that's really the introductory words, because we have to keep going. I'm told to be very strict. So it's 10 minutes each for the remaining people. If we finish early, all to the good, and we could join some of the other groups. Now, one thing I have had put to me very strongly after this morning's discussions, where there was such stress by some people on human rights, is to remember that they only come about as a result of duties and responsibilities. There is a point of view which we may wish to talk about in connection with any of the talks. Now, the first talk today is by my co-chair, Anita Vaivade, from the Institute of Latvian Culture. I probably said it all in the wrong direction. She's a docent there, which is a distinguished research position for 6 years, and she has written valuable works on this as a trained lawyer, and not only knowing the cultural heritage issue so very well. So may I introduce you? And I think after about 9 minutes, I may be seen standing up. Anyway, would you like this? And there is a presentation possibility there.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure being here. The task that I have today is to present experience we have in Latvia at national level. So the context of this discussion here is the context of human rights. And what I wanted to present is how international legal developments that we have had, mainly in the context of UNESCO, how they have been kind of integrated afterwards into national legislation. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. So the major reference, in fact, for my presentation, that's the UNESCO Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. I remember just a brief parallel. I remember a meeting, Europa Nostra meeting some years ago, concerning a research project, which was still led at that time, which was the project Heritage Counts for Europe, where the research results now have been already published and are accessible. But the discussion that I remember from that meeting is that at that point, the term intangible cultural heritage was quite absent from the vocabulary of people within the network of Europa Nostra. I believe that this has changed over the last years, but then this is very much of importance currently to be respectful not only to the tangible part, but also intangible part of the heritage. So this UNESCO convention currently has 172 countries, so it has become a global reference for also shaping national policies on intangible cultural heritage. It also means that the concept of intangible heritage has been translated into a number of languages and a number of national policies. So it has been quite a global policy-making tendency. Pictures that you are seeing here are taken from an exhibition that took place during the Song and Dance celebration, which is also recognized as Latvian, and not only Latvian, but Baltic intangible cultural heritage element. taking a look at this convention, which dates back from 2003, then participation is in fact one of the key terms within the convention. And it shows up in a number of places, but in particular in two articles. One is concerning the role of states, where there are mainly like two major obligations. One is to adopt necessary measures, mainly policy measures, for the sake of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. And then the other one is mainly identifying or setting national inventories of intangible cultural heritage. And in both of these cases, state parties are really expected to be the ones who are involving in all possible ways communities within these processes. So as it is highlighted here at the end of this article, so with the participation of communities, groups, and relevant non-governmental organizations. The other article where this is particularly emphasized is specifically under such a title, Participation of Communities, Groups, and Individuals. And here we see also, as was also raised this morning, so this importance to have both like individual but also community or group format of participation involved. So all these forms are mentioned here. And then it speaks in particular, that participation of communities, groups, and where appropriate individuals need to be really taken care of by states parties. So, I'm sorry. So one thing is convention, other thing is so-called operational directives, which have been adopted after the convention. But then there is something in addition, and that is the all the time ongoing process of the interpretation of this convention, which is mainly taking place in the Intergovernmental Committee for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, where there are 24 countries being elected from all over the world. And this committee is taking decisions on different questions concerning the convention. This committee is also taking decisions about inscriptions on UNESCO lists of intangible cultural heritage, but this is only one part of its mandate. And why I'm mentioning this committee at this particular moment, because there have been also decisions taken which put even in more nuance which are the demands concerning participation of communities, groups, and individuals. And the extras that you see here mainly concern, in fact, expectations in regard to setting or establishing those national inventories of intangible cultural heritage. So mainly national lists of intangible heritage. So how they should be done.
Somebody told that is not hearing well. That's why I was requested to come to.
Maybe the person left already.
Is it worse now?
Is it?
Great. Okay.
If it gets worse, if you can react, and we'll try to. So, decision that you see here, those are the demands as for the setting up national inventories. So what is really being expected from states parties if these states parties would be willing to propose a nomination for international list. So it's somehow a condition for a nomination being proposed for UNESCO intangible heritage lists. And as you see, one of the demands or strongly emphasized things is namely about the participation, so that people concerned of particular intangible heritage elements would be constantly involved in the process of not only setting these inventories at national level, but then also regularly updating the information, completing the inventory, and so on and so on. So in a way that participation would need to be kind of a constant characteristics for the way how these inventories are working. So what we see concerning national legislation, there are quite different cases in different countries, how countries do react to the necessity to implement this international convention concerning intangible cultural heritage. There are cases where the interest towards intangible heritage is being integrated within existing national laws. One of quite recent examples is France, where within its law on cultural heritage and artistic creation, they have integrated a reference to the convention, which is just as a one article saying that cultural heritage is also intangible cultural heritage as it is understood by this UNESCO convention, which is in comparison to the whole set of the content of this law. Of course, is a very, very minor part of it, but anyway, it gives reference. There are cases where new laws have been elaborated specifically on intangible heritage as a response towards the UNESCO convention, and that is the case of Latvia, where we have a national law being adopted last autumn, which entered into force the 1st of December, and now it's the process of the implementation that has been undertaken. And that is a separate law in addition to another law which is taking care of the tangible part of cultural heritage. There are cases where certain legislation has been existing before this 2003 convention, because of course it could be quite misleading to imagine that internationally the interest that came in 2003 towards intangible cultural heritage, that could be something very, very novatory in regard to what was happening already at national level in various countries, because we do have national legislations which date back even like decades and decades in different countries, which are in relation to intangible heritage. And here, just to give an example, for instance, Lithuania, the neighboring country of Latvia, they have since the 1990s their national laws on what they are calling as ethnic cultural heritage. Of course, we can debate about the choice of terms, but anyway, it is in relation to the field of intangible cultural heritage. And then there are a number of laws which do not deal directly with heritage issues, but which are very important, in fact, to the field of safeguarding heritage. And those are kind of connected fields. It might be, for instance, legislation concerning taxes, which in the end can have certain impact on, let's say, the enterprises who are working with heritage-related products. Or it might be also laws concerning environment or natural heritage, which are in connection also to cultural heritage. So these are different parallel fields. So to give you a very, very brief insight into the content of this national law, it is very, very concise, very small, very short in a way. It has only 12 articles, including things said about the national inventory, including particular role that the collection of the archives of Latvian folklore has, but I'm not going to go in deeper in that. And then there are specific things said about the participation of communities, also planning, financing, some involvement of Cultural Capital Foundation, and some responsibilities of institutions at national level who are taking care of intangible cultural heritage field, namely the Latvian National Center for Culture. So in the context of the conversation that we are having today, so that part of the law which might be of more importance for our discussion is concerning participation of communities. And what is being put in this national law is namely, on the one hand, saying that communities definitely participate in development planning, which means in setting up different policies, not only at national level, but also at municipal level. Also, participation in nomination listing and education programs. And concerning education programs, I think that is something very, very, very important, where we will still be looking at the impact that this particular thing could have, this content, because this is a little bit kind of stepping into another field within the field of education, which has its own regulatory frameworks, and where there are quite a set of demands how a person could or could not be contributing, let's say, as a teacher. But then in this framework of intangible cultural heritage legislation, it is namely opening doors, for instance, for different masters that have certain knowledge or certain skills, so that they would be able to come to schools and propose some teaching. Then there are rights to the title of the element, which mainly concerns the name of intangible cultural heritage elements that would be recognized at national level, to the reference to this element, and also to the information about it. And concerning information, it was mainly a bit of concern about whether all, let's say, research work that is being done about certain traditions, whether people who are really practicing those traditions are aware of all this research work being done, or whether they really do have access to all this information that has been collected. So it's mainly reassuring that people are informed about all the things that are being said or written about their heritage. And then the third thing is a little bit kind of reminder. It might be absent, in fact, from the content of the law, and it would anyway be there in force, but it's just reminding that one of the rights of communities, groups, persons, individuals, are also not to participate. So in fact, in those cases where there are some let's say policy measures developed or some initiatives from municipalities or government, then people are also able to say no, we don't want to implement those kind of ideas. I probably won't stay long to this, but the law also introduced definitions of some terms which are where those definitions are quite novatory in the context of the national legislation. So even definition of community. So we were also this morning discussing about the fact that community is a term that we use a lot, but where we don't have really a common definition for it. We don't have a definition definitely at international level. We try to have one here within the national legislation, mainly referring in fact to the matter that community is something where people are united around the interest or the concern about their heritage. So somehow relation to heritage is the core of setting up community in this context of this particular law. The definition of intangible cultural heritage is really taken quite directly from the UNESCO Convention on Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, with the only specificity that I mention here, that the interest of the legislator was particularly to emphasize the cultural heritage, which is in a way specific to Latvia, or cultural traditions specific to Latvian territory. This might raise a bit of question, so what do we do also with intangible cultural heritage of migrants, for instance, or people coming to different territories or then going away, and which is quite a topic also discussed internationally. And then also the purpose of the law also gives reference to the idea that the diversity of culture traditions within Latvia is something that the law is taking care. Question why is mainly why that kind of law would be needed, because of course there are countries who deal well enough with intangible heritage issues without having a national legislation. And the answers that I propose here are really characteristic of the case of Latvia. Those are observations I've had being witnesses of quite all the debates that we had over a number of years before coming to this national legislation. So what have been the answers that have been pronounced by different people? So for state and municipal institutions, there was an interest, in fact, to have what I name as valid reference, or mainly to say that we have a law, so in fact that so activities that we would like to have for our institution are somehow based within the ideas set in this law. For communities or people who are really practicing different traditions, having different skills and knowledge and so on, for people it has been quite strongly expressed that having a law would mean that it is a testimony of value. In other words, that by this gesture of adopting a national law, then the legislator is saying that this is a field of importance for the country. For different institutions involved, I mentioned also archives of folklore, for instance. For those institutions, it means having that kind of national law, it means a certain promise of support, including financial support. As the law is coming along with certain instruments for financing national policies, then this is kind of promise that this assistance could be a long-term support. And for communities and individuals connected to intangible heritage, it might be a potential reference for defending their rights. I say potential because I think it will depend very much whether this law will be really taken into account in cases where some other interests will be in question as well. We have, for instance, one case where a situation was brought to the Constitutional Court of Latvia, but at that time, it was some years ago, then the argument about safeguarding intangible cultural heritage was not really the one who was in the end decisive about the situation. So in that sense, I say potential reference, and we'll see how it's going to really be done. So that is setting a little bit kind of the major points that I feel being important concerning Latvian case about national legislation. And I will conclude just with some research interests that we are working on together with some other colleagues. So at the Latvian Academy of Culture, we are having a research project together with a French institution in Paris, the Institute for Political Social Sciences, namely being interested in how we can observe this diversity of national legislations, how countries are taking care of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage through different legal means. And this is the project that we are working on. And then a little bit kind of as a consequence of this project that we undertook already some years ago, and this is a very, very recent, we established at the Latvian Academy of Culture UNESCO chair, which is a specific format to highlight certain fields of interest or certain fields of research, and namely having a research or this chair about intangible cultural heritage policies and law. So in that sense, being quite in connection also with the topicality that is internationally there, and which is also very much recognized by UNESCO, that there is this need to see how countries are really dealing with intangible cultural heritage issues at national level. And and just to conclude, that we are going to have this fall a particular interest in connection between intangible heritage and nature, namely with interest to see how legislations which have been developed for environment, for natural heritage, and the ones for intangible heritage, whether there are some collisions or how they are working together or not. So that is our interest for the next topic of discussion to come. That would be all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for most fascinating and clear and wide-ranging discussion. There's so many things there we could pick up in our conversation afterwards, and I'm so very grateful to you for putting together such an excellent summary of where you are currently and where you have been in creating this great structure in which many countries, I'm sure, could emulate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shall we together now ask now Alessandro Camiz. Camiz, I won't pronounce it right, Alessandro, I'm sure. He tells me he's Italian really, so I can do the Alessandro very well.
That is correct, Camiz.
Camiz. And he's from the International Center for Heritage Studies, Girne American University in Cyprus. And I know how much he's been involved in Europa, Nostra, Cyprus, new element to try and help the country, two halves of the island, get together more. And on the other hand, being involved in a Byzantine monastery not far from Girne. So, Alessandro, I'll let you get your, you've already got it together, technical parts.
Thank you.
And
we
look forward to your talk.
Sure. Thank you so much. There was a video that I sent with the PowerPoint. It was not downloaded. I can do without. I mean, if it's not possible, I can indeed do without the video. No, there are two files. One is the PowerPoint, and the other one is an MP4. The video, which I cannot see, but I can do without. Sorry, I have a cold. So I hope I can speak clearly because my throat is sore. I'm going to present. Okay.
I see what I can do now.
Don't worry, I can do without. If you handle it, I can show it later. Otherwise, it's not going to be a big issue. So I'm going to talk about the monastery of Acheiropoietos, or Acheiropoietos, if we want to pronounce it in the way classical Greek is pronounced, which is a Byzantine monastery in the northern side of Cyprus, which today belongs to the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which is an unrecognized country. United Nations are not recognizing the country. Anyhow, that country is there since 1984. In 2014, I was called to go and teach architecture at the Girne American University and to direct the International Center for Heritage Studies, which has been assigned by FCAF, which is their religious foundation handling religious property in Turkish countries, the monastery itself. The monastery was within an army site until 2010. So for this reason, it was not accessible to the United Nations and the Bicameral Technical Committee of Heritage in Cyprus to be surveyed and included in the heritage list. In Cyprus, religious buildings, so Christian buildings in the north and Muslim buildings in the south, are restored through a bicameral agreement process, which goes through a bicameral technical committee, which comprises members from those both communities, with the support of the United Nations Development Program, and eventually funded by European Union. So there is a list of monuments. And at that time, the monastery was not accessible. In 2010, instead, the monastery was assigned to Girne American University for custody and restoration. And so when I came there, I handled the possibility for the Bicameral Technical Committee and the United Nations representative to come and visit the monastery. And they did. Things happened very slowly in Cyprus, if you might know, but it was finally slowly included in the list. But I'm going to talk about this list later. So you can see up there where the monastery is. On the northern coast, west of Kyrenia, in an area called Lambuza, today Lapta, or Lapitos. The monastery sits in the outskirts of what used to be an urban settlement, that of Lambuza, the shining one, if I translate correctly from Greek, which is now an archaeological site. That archaeological area, especially the Acropolis, was excavated by Myris, and it is in part published. That Acropolis is another very interesting heritage site in the north. It still is under the custody of the army, so it is not formally accessible, but I handle to go there and take pictures and make some surveys. I hope we can do more in the future. Let's go back to the monastery. So in 2014, what we started to do is essentially documentation, survey, archaeological and historical research to establish the basis for, in future, a possible restoration of the building, which is in a pretty good condition compared to other buildings in the island, because having been within the custody of the army before the Cypriot army, later the Turkish army, and finally the Turkish Cypriot army, it has been preserved pretty well. No one entered in the site. It was so the building is in pretty good conditions compared to other buildings, but has a few problems. Some of these problems are quite urgent. You can see the settlement of Cherinia, as it was represented in the Peutingerian table, which is supposedly a 12th century representation of the known world at that time, and as it is in the Girne map, near the ruins of Lambuza or Lapitos, and as it is represented in the cadastral map right here. The former harbor of Lambuza, which is now a public beach, and the Acropolis, which is today an army site, we can see mosaics everywhere on the floor. We can see fragments of Roman and Greek columns and capitals. The ruins of the houses of the urban settlement and of the temples are there in the countryside. So they indeed need to be surveyed at least before somebody will obliterate them forever, as it did happen to some of these mosaics last year. A truck came and just took them away. So those mosaics that were visible next to the church of Agios Eulambios are not there anymore. So it is urgent that we do something. If we cannot restore for the political situation, but we have to make surveys, because these monuments could disappear. So the church of Panagia Acheiropoietos is a very complex building which dates back in its first phase, the one in black in this plan, to a 6th or 5th century Paleo-Christian basilica, a three-nave, three-apse longitudinal Latin church, which eventually collapsed during an earthquake in the 6th century, and later was rebuilt. I mean, another building was built on top of the ruins of that church using the former apse of that building in the shape of a late Byzantine Catholicon, so a 5-bay central plan building, eventually late 11th century. That building was enlarged in 3 distinctive separate phases, 12th, 13th, 14th century, adding one after the other one esonatixes, so outside porches. So that in the end, in the last phase, the Gothic or Frankish porch, which dates back to the end of the 14th century, takes the shape of a Gothic building with ribbed vaults, lancet arches, and all the features typical of that style in the island of Cyprus. Inside the building, well, in the on the side of the apse, of the central apse, there is a well connecting to a network of underground aqueducts, which eventually went all the way to the spring close by and to the city of Latvios, connecting also to the nearby church, which I'm going to show you in a minute. On the apse, we have a series of apostles or male standing figures with scrolls painted in not very much visible in this picture. Anyhow, a very important painting, which needs to be restored also. And around the main church, as usually happens in the Orthodox typology of monastery, we have the cells of the monks. So the structure of the building, I'll show you a plan later, it has the church in the middle and the monastery around with a portico. And this building, these buildings also belong to different phases. The earliest one apparently dates to the 13th century with pointed arches, and the last one was built as a reconstruction in style in the 20th century. Within one of these buildings, the southern one, which is eventually a false building, it has been built by the Department of Antiquities in the 1950s and 60s using fragments of the buildings. We have also the base of a statue of the Emperor Tiberius, which used to be in the gymnasium of the city of Latvios, with the Greek inscription, which is published, and basically says who is the one dedicating the statue, and it is dated 18 November 29 after death. Another very relevant artifact that is in the area. You can see here the main facade of the last Frankish Gothic porch of the building, and on the side, the cells of the monks. In this side, as you can see quite clearly, we have a statical problem. Actually, let's go back. We have three separate and different restorations that were done there in, I would say, early 20th century, late 50s and 1990s. The one in masonry, the one in reinforced concrete, and the last one in steel scaffolding, which are, with different technologies, trying to solve the same problem, which is discontinuity in the building. You can notice that this arch is higher than this one. So in that part, the building has slabs on two different levels and consists of two different phases of construction. So there's a node, a joint, that doesn't work properly. So in different times, different restorations attempt try to fix the problem. The last one, which dates 2010, the scaffolding, was done. I mean, it is preserving the building from falling apart, but it does have some problems. I'm going to show you a detailed picture in a while. So I made an emergency damage report to the department, to the Bi-Communal Technical Committee and to the United Nations, showing how endangered this column is here. That is dated February 15, 2015. So this is what that area of the building looked like in 1896 when a photographical survey was done, and what it looks like to now. So you can see that this column, I mean, 1, 2, 3, and 4 columns have problems, but this one in particular is completely out of its own barycenter line, and so the vertical line through the barycenter of the column does go out of the third part of the base, which means, for those who are not technical, that it's falling. It should not be there, it should not stand. The reason why it is standing, why it is still standing, is because of the scaffolding holding it in place, but this scaffolding was not done very well, so it is moving slowly. Every month I go there and I found some centimeters more of the scaffolding going back. Actually, you can notice that the scaffolding is pushing on the church, and it is pushing on the church using some wooden elements which are bending in time. So every day that column goes some centimeters ahead. One day, hopefully 100 years from now, but one day that column will fall if we don't do anything. And if it does fall, 1 and 2 bays on the second floor, 1 and 2 bays on the first floor will collapse. And so that is the least damage that would happen if that column falls. So first, for this reason, I called as an emergency on the Bi-Communal Technical Committee and the United Nations to have the building included in the heritage list in Cyprus, so that it was legally possible to do something. And this happened. In the meanwhile, with the research center, we organized an international workshop with the cooperation of the University of Florence and University of Rome Sapienza. And during the workshop, we worked on the recognition of the damage and the designing a system to exhibit archaeological findings inside the monastery. We made a survey of the building, and we designed a garden, and we surveyed the mosaics inside the monastery. Not the ones outside, we didn't have the time, but now they're disappeared. So see how urgent it is to do these things. Well, the video was about the survey, but if it's not here, it's not.
No, I have it here. I can.
Okay, maybe I can show it at the end.
It's
better.
do I put it now?
Okay, sure.
I think we could allow that now because it would fit in. So
Okay,
nice
okay, it's
video.
very short.
I try at least. I don't see why it wouldn't work anyway. Maybe the voice. Maybe there's a problem with the voice. Let's see. No, I'm hearing it only here. don't know how to put voice now for this. Wait. No, I don't want that. Okay.
You want the voice over, Alessandro? You want the voice over? Very short.
That's it.
Okay, thank you.
That's
So
try
this
to
is
find
a short
back
video showing the laser scanner survey that was done at the monastery. The cloud point generated within the workshop was then processed with a number of graduation master theses in University of Florence, University of Rome, University of Venice. And so we have the complete survey, including plans. As you can see, so this is the Catholicon in gray, the former 6th century basilica, and the 4 additions with the Gothic exonarthex right here, the earliest phase of the monastery and the later additions, and this last part, which actually is reconstruction in style done by the Department of Antiquities. And we have the inside elevations and sections, and the outside. Actually, this one was very difficult to do because the building, the inside of the building belongs, well, it is assigned to our university. The outside of the building is within a military area. So it was not possible to go there, but we did. Again, we gave this information about the damage and the urgency. We have a survey of the masonry types and the mortar types. We have a survey of all the artifacts. And finally, I would like to talk about the Lambuza treasure. Just 1 minute. In the early 1910, a peasant in the area found 6 silver dishes representing the history of David. These dishes are now in the Metropolitan Museum, part of them. One part is in the Nicosia Archaeological Museum, one part is in the British Museum. So we designed a proposal of an exhibition of the original foundings of the Lambuza treasure within the monastery. The treasure comprises the 6 dishes plus a number of golden and silver pieces. As I said, part of them are now in London, part in New York, and part in Nicosia. I think it would be proper not only to restore the building and save it from ruin, but also have it be a visitable, accessible heritage place. Thank you.
Again, we've been very lucky to have such an extensive summary of most valuable documentation. I mean, at the house level of expert knowledge, of academic input, of knowledge of the literature, yet with practical applications to try and save a building and its tangible and intangible part efforts through the only possible legal channels. And I can only admire your persistence. No doubt it shows work over many years by a committed group of people to try and save some most valuable things, and you're using United Nations and UNESCO efforts to try and do that, and that's the human rights legislation part of what you do. Of course, it fits so well with Europa Nostra. Those of us who've been involved with and had great interest in the work of Europa Nostra and trying to bring the communities together. You know, on the borders we've had our walks and works with close with government, and of course through Dino Leventis, who we all remember with great affection, who has been was such a wonderful treasurer of ours, and the Leventis Foundation supported, of course, the museum in Nicosia referred to is much of his work is involved there, and much of the work that is now going on as a result of his contribution and the continuing contribution of them. So it all integrates very nicely, and I'd like to thank you very much for that presentation.
Thank you.
Before I hand over to Anita, I'll just say that again, to those who weren't here before, that we are unlucky, we're very unlucky not to have Eva Kristelina Hardy with us today. It was a marvelous opportunity organised by Anna Maya and of course,
Sushi Thomas actually was there.
I see. Well, thank you as well. Yeah, thank you very much. To have her work on the Sami culture, but alas, her father died last night, we think, and she Saturday, and she didn't feel able to come. As I said, we sent our sincere condolences to her, and I'm so very sorry we couldn't see her today. At that point, I think I'll hand over to my colleague.
Yes, and then it's my pleasure to go on with our discussion. Ask Mr. Peter Collins to tell us about the case of the United Kingdom. Peter Collins, as you all know, is chairman of the Europa Nostra in the United Kingdom and also a member of the Europa Nostra Council. But it is also a very particular characteristic definitely to mention to my mind is also the fact of being a mathematician, which might be quite important also to the way how we look to things and the world. So the floor is yours.
think you're hearing too much my voice today, and I'll just say one or two things in the 10 minutes allowed about the... Shall I use this? This is better for you at the back, isn't it? Yes. Let me talk a bit about the planning system. What I said I would be prepared to do is talk about how the participation can happen through the legislation in the UK to do the best we can for cultural heritage. And since 1920s, we've had quite a strict planning code. Only an attempt to ruin it has only happened in the last 3 or 4 years. And that has been our occupation in trying to do something about it and preserve the best things about it. I mean, the government then, keen on helping austerity go away, had the view that we can get out of our austerity by doing lots of building. And behind all the ideas of improving on the planning legislation, which seemed very good to me, they created a new national planning policy framework. And before you could do a local plan, you had to have a lot of consultative process with the public before you could approve a local plan which dealt with the detail of a particular district. Districts are, let's say, 20 miles by 20 miles, 30 kilometers by 30 kilometers in size. And then they brought in, because they said, oh, it is important we have the big society involved. I think this is Cameron in his re-election, the then Prime Minister, the big society, and that was to get communities involved in everything more. I think it was to save money for the district councils, that people would do the council's work. When one looked at the sort of legislation they were thinking of, it wasn't that you could stop development, but rather perhaps you could say where you would like it put, rather than where you would not like to have it put locally. Anyway, we are used to having consultation of everywhere, anybody, about everything. But the question then is, what do you do with the consultations? I have been in many rooms with 10 round tables and 10 members of the local council, one on each, and with whiteboards in which much is discussed, much is written down, then conclusions, we're going to do it soon, aren't we? Conclusions are said, and then the thing goes away. There is some publication in the end of what was said in the meeting, done well or badly, and then the council will make its mind up. And often you see not many changes. But of course the district councils are caught between the people underneath wanting to do certain things, different things, and the national policy with which it has to conform, and that's why it has to wait on the national policy, and everything then takes time. Of course, what is happening in the time between a national policy with many gaps is brought in, between that and when a local policy can be finally approved after the layers of consultation and all the different things that have to happen, gives developers a marvellous opportunity of helping the Chancellor of the Exchequer build buildings in all sorts of places. Everything is open. When something is to be built, there is, of course, all the houses nearby get sent notices, which you can complain or say whatever comment you like about the proposals to build, be it an outhouse in the back garden, as long as it's something that's, you can do it as long as it's not more than 2 meters, but if it's above 2 meters it needs planning, and then there will be a consultation, there will be the committee set up to look at it, and all these things are gone through before the plans can be approved by the district. In the end, your district, the 30 kilometre by 30 kilometre area, is the place where the decisions are made. And you can go along to the meeting, you can ask to speak, you'll get 3 minutes, there will be a clock ticking to say what you have to say. So on the face of it, there's every possible opportunity to say things, but it's a question of how it's implied. If the proposal is turned down by the district council, then of course the applicant can appeal. So it then goes to a national inspector, and the national inspector is very experienced and very clever, and will look at all the issues, and his report will contain the 5,000 reasons why it shouldn't be built. But at the end of the day, if the council hasn't met its national target for building, and if it's a good council, it probably hasn't, then the last line will be, but because they haven't met the target, it has to be built. And it could be in a green field which hasn't been decided upon if we haven't yet got our local plan in place. So a lot of us have spent, I'm chairman of the local campaign to protect rural England. I've spent 5 weeks with an inspector looking at the district council's proposed local plan in a room with a row of developers here, a row of different local interests there, all being listened to and written down, and he's actually been very fair in allowing us lots of things to say. And one thing I will say at the end is where we have won. Right? We're supposed to be inspiring you with hope. At the moment, I'm depressing you with despair. But in fact, we are asked to give where the human rights and the participation give hope. And I will give you one of those at the end. So these are the different levels. Neighbourhood plans. All right. So we've got now a new, they said we will do away with the 1,000 pages which have come up. Now, may I say, all the time, ministers make statements. The things that are specially protected in the United Kingdom are areas of outstanding national beauty. We call them AONB. They are like the North Wessex Downs, a marvellous chalk area which has exceptional European, any standards, chalk streams which have exceptional crayfish in them and do all sorts of amazing things. That is one great place. It's quite a large area, and it is an AONB, and nothing can be done in that area without very exceptional reasons. The second place is something called green belts. They were put in, I don't know, 50 years ago, was it, or more? Around every town, you probably have it in your countries too, around every town, in order to stop what we call urban sprawl of the town. And we don't like a ribbon development either. We have these green belts around towns of a good size, especially of historic nature. Oxford, where I live, has a green belt which is constantly under attack because the city wants to expand and the districts around it, which have different political positions, do not want it to happen in their bit of the green belt around Oxford. So there's Oxford and four districts round it. And one of them is the one I chair, which has an area of outstanding natural beauty, a bit of the green belt, a western forest, and a floodplain. Where do you put houses? So we were originally told, oh, they'll have to be because of net migration into the county, not meaning international migration, just from other places in the country, but including all those extra people which the British government, because they're not good at borders, don't know how many people are there. So there seem to be a lot of people using the health service, using the schools, which we don't know, and we don't have identity cards, you see. So there's this big problem of how you cope with the lack of infrastructure. That's the big shout of everybody about the infrastructure. The roads are bad, the highways have no money, and you have the big roads which at times of rush are full, so the traffic gets put into smaller roads, which then run through the villages, but what happens to the children? I mean, there are all those sorts of issues for which we have ways of consultation. We have the human rights to say, but how do you get things actually done? So that is the context in which we fight. The third area, but I say I've already said the green belts and the areas of outstanding natural beauty. There is also areas of special scientific interest, and they're the third category, which needs a very special thing. The 5 reasons for setting up a green belt, and I could have given you a complicated set of rules. All of them have to be obeyed for it to become a green belt, and you have to, if you want to build in the green belt, you have to answer each of the 5 conditions if you want to have a chance of being considered. But now everybody says, we so need houses. Mrs. Thatcher stopped building council. We used to have council houses, a certain number built, and this would provide a stock of affordable living. And what the country is short of at the moment is houses, affordable houses. Even if you build the smallest house in Britain at the moment, it seems not so cheap. And then, of course, there's the question of the availability of cash because of the banks now have stricter rules of who they can lend money to. There is all that issue going on, as will be in all your countries. So we have all that problem as well. Right. So there I was, chairman of the Vale of Whitehorse district of the Campaign to Protect Rural England, arguing with the inspector sent from National, who is so nervous because of all the consultation process. He couldn't accept an invitation to lunch after the whole thing was over, just in case I happened to appear at some other court he was dealing with. And so he has to keep an enormous distance from everybody he is dealing with. He cannot talk to them, he cannot admit he knows them, he can smile at you as you go into the room, is about as near as he will get to you, because he mustn't be under attack at all from having favoritism. And of course, with there being this bank of developers on the one side, people are very conscious of their human rights to try and stop this terrible development, if it happens to be a terrible development rather than good development. And of course, may I say, the Campaign to Protect Rural England isn't NIMBY in the sense that it wants to stop all development. It's right buildings in the right place is our call to arms in respect of development. So there we are in front of the inspector. And there is the former Harwell site. Harwell's very famous internationally because it's where they did the work on nuclear bombs in England. And indeed, one of my colleagues in college was temporary director of Harwell, so it's well known. It's near Oxford, and those people involved in quantum theory and relativity theory and any related topics to molecular study often go there and give seminars. In the old days, you had to get a badge and be welcome through the door. It stopped doing that a long time ago, and then there was just a question of decommissioning the land. And now, having decommissioned the land, it was thought by the government to be an excellent place to develop a new innovation strategy. So, Cabinet is saying, well, Cambridge is doing this, Oxford ought to be doing that. We need to develop a special innovation research thing. Oxford is superb at doing its research, but what about having a development area where we could do economic things with that? So there has to be roads, there have to be connection, and people have to be put in any number of houses, and you make an area called the science area, which is a big area around the former Harwell campus. Harwell campus was already built in the AONB a long, long, long time ago. So could you develop that so that people could live there? And then you, of course, have to decide how many are rented accommodation, where people could come and go for temporary periods, and whether you would allow infrastructure. Of course, if you build a big road, then you have warehouses put on it, if you're not very careful, by big firms, and they're very ugly, and that means lots of extra heavy roads ruining all your heavy vehicles ruining your roads. There are all sorts of implications as to what other development is allowed alongside the special development to make the innovation strategy work, which might be an exceptional reason for putting things in the area of outstanding natural beauty. So 1,400 houses were proposed for the little bit of AONB under consideration. Very visible from all around. They always say, in our planning things, it always says, views from exceptional viewpoints are important in any planning consideration. So it's no question, from exceptional viewpoints, you can see it a lot. And 1,400 houses is a lot. So we battled it. And in the end, I can say to you, along this round Ridgeway, there is the old 3,000-year-old Whitehorse of great artistic as well as historic value, and a whole range of little villages which make up a beautiful landscape and of great value. In the end of the day, the inspector ruled that the 1,400 houses should not be built, but we have to find somewhere else in the floodplain, in the Western Forest, in the Greenbelt, whilst meeting the unmet need. Now a new rule of houses which Oxford can't find anywhere to build. Where do we put them? So let's be hopeful. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much both for raising some historical references. As for legal developments, you mentioned 1920s already. That is something that is very important, I believe, to every single country, because we are having our national histories on the way how legislations are being developed. And also, as you mentioned, one thing is the framework or the procedures which are set, but then how we really put them in practice, and what is the substance of decisions in the end taken. And thank you for giving hope as well. So thank you a lot. So we do have now time for questions and answers and discussion.
Yes, we're meant to be having a discussion, and we're meant to have some input to conclusions. Yeah. So, you go to them. Sit down. I don't know if there is. Anna, can we have a little more light? I think I don't know what I'm meant to do to put the lights up.
Lights, okay.
Yes, is there a switch?
I think they are there, actually.
I'm not good at finding switches.
It's a
Sorry.
screen, they must be here. So front here. More lights in there.
Yes.
Here. Is it helping anything?
I think
Is
they
this getting
they're
better?
seeing too much of us now.
Too much.
Yeah, no, I'm only joking. Yeah, shall I give you the microphone? Would you like to tell us something?
I thought your remarks were of peculiar interest, I would say, in terms of UNEs, of universal value, because all countries are confronted with this problem. I thought in your case, what puzzled me is that there is a kind of quota which has to be built, and if you don't have enough houses which are admissible because of natural beauty and other criteria, they have to be built in order to fill the number of homes that have to be built compulsory. That is something to me that is particularly unsustainable. And thus I was wondering if you could tell a little more on how this works and how this could stopped. And then I will have another question which is more of international value.
Yes. That is a big question. I mean, the quotas aren't just pulled out of the air. They come along with the number of houses approved by the inspector. The plan has to... Right. Originally, the Campaign to Protect Rural England was thinking in the two levels of consultation. The first one, we fight very hard, and on the 13,000 extra houses expected to be built by 2031, which is the planning period for which the local plan will apply, we will come to some sort of compromise. But then, undemocratically, the government, with its need for the innovation strategy, comes from very high up and sets up what has now be called a growth board, which had on it a local economic partnership, the local universities, because of the innovation strategy, not developers, but people who have aspirational economics in mind, not provable. We had our own, we employed CPRE, our own economists, to show how wrong it was. But there was a system, and the government employed people who set up what's called a strategic housing market assessment, which took local economic partnerships and what could be done into consideration, and then the local district heads would go to a meeting and fight out between them how they would take the houses which they were told they had to have. And the houses they were told to have was not 13,000, but 20,000. So it was then, those figures were argued about. The Campaign to Protect Rural England now decided they were going to fight that tooth and nail with their own economists as much as they could, and we're still doing it. Because we could not see how so many houses could be fitted in. Nobody built that many houses a year in our area ever. The economic thing seemed unlikely. And now that we have, of course, I'm not mentioning it, the B word, But things are more uncertain, and yet it is still gone ahead, because I get from one end the idea that we need a letter from the Chief Planning Officer in London to rethink the whole business right in the middle. And if we don't have a plan, the developers can do anything they like anyway. So you're caught between the developers, but the number of houses comes, and with it, it's five-year target. Now, that's a rolling target over a 5-year period, which moves each year on, and you're trying to aim at the so many houses by 2031. So that's how the target comes along, and some districts manage, and some have great difficulty managing just because of the obvious objections which were made on particular proposals, and you're relying on the developers to make the proposals, and they make good ones, and generally ones are less satisfactory. So that's how it happens, but the government needs houses. You see, you will have people like the development secretary of the Labour Party before the last election, who would say, we need houses, and if they have to be built all over the AONB, they have to be built all over the AONB. The government wouldn't say that, and certainly most of the country wouldn't say that. But there is this very big tension between perhaps a right or wrong economic view by the government of what the country needs, and the lead of local people who in my village and other villages said they came to live there because of the sort of place it was, not the sort of place which the government would force on it.
Now
so that's how it works.
Two sub-questions. The first one, and then I come to the international. The sub-question is, how can you make a difference between green belt, between green fields and brown fields? Because the answer, of course, to build houses, and that is a little more expensive than green fields, is to reuse existing disused buildings. And how do you apply, as a man interested in conservation, to have at the same time renewal and the expansion of areas which need to be rebuilt, and in order to save the green belt? That is, for example, what in Toscana has been done for a decade.
Yes. Again, I think this is of enough interest to a lot of people for me to continue on this track. Well, the answer to this is that the campaign to protect rural England is, number one, it is brownfields. I think, and government in ministerial statements is quite clear too, that brownfields come first. But if you go to Oxford City, which has always wanted to expand, every time they have a brownfield, they don't build affordable houses on it, they give more jobs. And now they expect the districts to pick up the houses they need in order that should give somewhere for the people who have this job, because the city has had this expansion view for 20 or 30 years. And the trouble is that from his heritage point of view, the setting in the Greenbelt and from the hills around it of the historic city matter enormously. Yet maybe the city council believes more that the size of the town isn't right for what it should be. And so there is this constant tension. But everywhere, brownfield comes first. Now, when it came to the National Planning Policy Framework, there's another success here, because the CPRE and the National Trust fought hard for, okay, you agree we save the green belt, but what about the lesser value green fields? And the answer, because if you don't put in that protection of any green area, which was in the old plan, then 55% of the green fields unbuilt on in England will become up for grab from developers. And we had something put in the national plan that protected us from that. So there's quite a clear distinction between green fields, which are fought over when you have no brown fields. In the Vale of White Horse, where I am, there are almost no brownfield sites. It's very sad. We want the brownfield sites so we can tell them to put their houses on it, but there aren't any. So it's greenfields or nothing, and then you want to have it nearby, and then the infrastructure arguments come in. All our primary schools, the 7 to 11-year-old, they're all full. The roads are not well repaired. The rat runs and the stationary vehicles happen all the time. What about the health facilities? These are the issues we find ourselves fighting on.
I don't want to monopolize, and so I won't ask the international question. I just want to add one point, is that you seem to have forgotten the SACTRA report.
Which?
SACTRA, the Standing Committee on Road Assessments,
that's,
which indicates that when you create new roads, you create more traffic and more plan, and the need more creates a need for more. Okay, I'm sorry to. I think other stuff.
Yes, I think we should allow everybody else. Jacek's been trying rather hard. Will you first? Please, Carl.
Yeah.
Do you want to come or do you want to speak?
No, I can sit.
Shall I
Can you
do
take?
this?
Which seems to be working.
Yeah.
Yes, we should have done that first. It's much more important. Yes, that looks very pretty.
Yeah. No, I'm thinking about this with human rights, cultural heritage, and as we have Natalia from Ukraine, I think it would be interesting to hear her opinion about this with legislation and so on. Does it have any effect? Because I have the sensation that when there is a conflict, legislation has less values, etc. And we also have two gentlemen from Turkey, who is also a country having a war on the border and a difficult political thing. So I think how to hear some about the problems with human rights and cultural heritage in areas which have conflicts.
Let's broaden the discussion as much as we can now. Yes, let's keep away from England.
Can I make it?
Do you want?
Question.
The question. No, I wonder how we can say that the current political situation in Turkey affects human rights and cultural heritage. Because you have the war in Syria, that's in the border, and you have the interior political. So how does it affect work with cultural heritage?
Not
Human rights.
now is not working. Heritage, so because is okay. I say. Olur.
I think as far as human rights goes, I think it's at the lowest point in Turkey. I mean, it's politically, anything to do with freedom of press and journalists and whatever, that's at a low point. I mean, it's a no-go area. People are imprisoned continuously, so you can't protest anything, and not in writing, but not also physically. You can't sort of walk on the streets and say, as far as, let's say, construction is concerned, we don't want this. No, you'll be arrested immediately. You can't, because you've got, at the moment, an authoritarian president, and underneath him there's nothing, and underneath that, people are just looking what else to do. There's, hardly anybody can raise the voice. As far as the Syrian conflict is concerned, of course, the over 3 million people walking over the border into Turkey, especially in the southeastern part of Turkey, where the big cities like Gaziantep or Diyarbakir are concerned, they are filled with people, and I mean, there's no respect, or you can't do anything about the conserved areas. It's just being walked over. That's also another problem. I mean, the issue is, for example, as far as conservation areas are concerned in Turkey, big cities, you can't do anything. I mean, people are wishing that somebody would come up and say, okay, we put a stop to construction, no more development. No, there is no concept of green belts, there is no concept of stopping construction. Places are being overbuilt, expanded, so it's a terrible loss as far as conservation goes, really. And that was also one point I was going to ask Peter, if I may. Have there been any, do you have the experience of a government passing a legislation and saying, okay, stop, we're going to put a stop to further construction, no more building in this town, in this city, or in this area, not only a green belt, but we're going to put a stop. I know it's got a conflict, economic and political, with construction companies, whatever, but has there ever been a case like that, where you put a stop to construction?
You're taking me back to England again. The system allows anybody to apply for development anywhere. You don't have to own the land, you don't have to be able to build on it. I could try and apply to build something where the Houses of Parliament is. It would be immediately destroyed because nobody's going to, But you can always, and there's nowhere, there isn't really, the idea of keeping things even, not to happen cumulatively, isn't built in. Anybody can try. It doesn't mean they succeed, they'll just be thrown out of court. But so there isn't any way of doing that. City as a district, the big cities are examples of districts, as I've said, for Oxford, and they can have plans. I mean, once you have a local plan in place, and it's quite clear where you'll have the houses and where you wouldn't have them up in the planning period, then that will affect what decisions are made by the planning committee and will affect the inspector if anything goes to appeal. In the meantime, of course, the developers are always talking, the people trying to develop are always talking to the civil servants in the planning departments, and the feeling, if you're trying to object to it, is they've been talking to one another, have got used to one another, and have somehow come to a compromise, which still doesn't suit the people who don't want it at all, but there is the idea that it will be built unless it's not. Yeah. Sustainable is the big word from anybody. Everybody talks about it must be sustainable. It's in the national policy. But what's the sustainable, the actual application of it on the ground is a matter of debate.
But from the human rights point of view,
yes.
I live in an area in London, I bought my flat or my house, and suddenly the Qataris come and develop that area. Then I go to a park over the river, there's Battersea Park, next to it there's huge construction going on, which was not there when I was living in there. These are all sort of, attacks on my human rights. I mean, and there's nothing one can do.
Well, you certainly, anybody has the right to object and to go to the planning meeting, and then you are up against what the local plan says you can do and what will happen if you don't meet your targets. And if it's something terrible, they'll stop it. In the view of the people at large, it should be stopped anyway. I mean, we're talking about a country that really has had, for 100 years, a planning system, and people recognize it, and you work through it. And it's just a question, if there's a particular push by the government that we need houses, we have all these people who don't have anywhere to live, they can't afford where to live, then they come up with ideas as to how you get over that problem. And certainly if you are somebody in the street who wasn't culturally heritage aware, they would see the argument, but we need houses. So they don't think, well, what do? They don't say, well, Germany, they have a different tax system and they have people in slightly higher buildings and they rent flats. The Englishman's house and his garden is his castle, and to get them out of that idea, but it's a very small landmass compared with some of the larger European countries, and they're going to have to change their mindset if people who care for the landscape have any real pressure. Sorry, I really didn't, I want to stop on England now. Natalia, perhaps you would like to talk to us about something entirely different.
Hello, there are different human rights, as we know. And speaking about my country, about Ukraine, as you know, Ukraine for the third year is in war with Russia, and this war is called by many different words, but still it is a war, and during war, any war, human rights are affected. And when human rights are affected also during war, any war, it's almost impossible and difficult to fight for cultural heritage, to defend cultural heritage. And I'm speaking now about the eastern part of Ukraine, Donbass, and about Crimea, and it's almost difficult for the cultural activists to do something in this period. And now I would like just to mention our Ukrainian film director Oleg Sentsov, who is in prison for 20 years. Now he's in Siberia because he was in Crimea. And what he was accused as being a terrorist, of course. because we know that big, huge countries would like to eliminate terrorism. So he started, for example, they started from the Ukrainian film director. And it is, while we're speaking about war, human rights, and cultural heritage, from my point of view, it should be the point of the special, absolutely special agenda. We shall start, of course, with Palmyra and all these tragedies. But, of course, these situations affect all the countries, not only the regions that are affected directly by the war in Ukraine, but still the activists and the civil society in Ukraine is very strong, and we are doing our job and in protecting cultural heritage, and consider cultural heritage as a very important topic or issue of the cultural diplomacy. Trying to promote our culture and to promote our messages through our cultural heritage. But it is not easy, and also we shall present our problems of the center of the downtown Kiev development that damage our cultural heritage into the next UNESCO session, and that's why I'm giving my mic to Jacek.
Exactly, Jacek, I was going to give you a last go. Tell us about Poland and to do with the World Heritage Sites.
Thank you. I'm not going to talk about Poland. I'm going to talk about human rights and legislation, because we shouldn't miss the topic.
Yes, exactly.
And I understand that the access to heritage is a basic human right. The question is, how shall we try to identify, also from the point of view of Europa Nostra and our mission, the existing conflicts and existing problems, especially within EU countries. Heritage versus legislation and human rights. I'm personally grateful to Dr. Anita for reminding us Convention of 2003 and emphasizing the meaning of intangible. And I will come to this point very soon, don't be afraid. But trying to make any structure, I think that we shall simply realize that looking at Europe and European tradition of monuments and heritage conservation, there are some basic standards. The first which comes to my mind, and is very much related to the desperate voice of Peter from England, is of course the problem which is a natural conflict, the problem of ownership, which is the fundamental right concerning the state of law, the democratic state of law, the ownership, which of course is limited if the state implements the law concerning conservation. And there are different standards of that in different European countries. But the basic rule is that if we control, if we limit your holy right to be the owner of the land, we shall compensate that in a very transparent way. And this is point number one. But it is the universal problem, and of course developers at the moment are all around. And the pressures of modernization. But it is, I understand, not the main and the major issue concerning our topic, human rights and legislation. This very topic touches the second standard, which is related to the Convention of 2003, which is the equality mark between heritage and the culture goods. What does it mean? It means that we have the equal right, in spite of our religion, our language, our nationality. And if we look at Europe at the moment, not at Syria or Middle East, but different European countries, there are natural conflicts concerning intangible, concerning memory, conflicting memories, concerning so-called dissonant heritage. And it is, in many cases, a conflict between legislation and human rights. So I can just give you one simple example concerning Poland, but it is the problem of the whole Central Europe and this fact that the borders were changed. It is a matter of ethnic minorities. It is a matter of the language and even the family names. If you take Lithuania, in Lithuania, a big Polish minority which has not been subjected concerning ethnic cleansing during the Stalinist time, still is not allowed to write their own name in Polish transcription. There are very different languages. So the problem of heritage and human rights and legislation, it is the ocean of conflicts and problems. And the question is to what extent Europa Nostra would be interested in, as we have the list named Heritage at Risk, to try to identify the major issues, which are hot issues concerning human rights, and this basic human right is access to heritage, and those very appealing, let's say, conflicts all around, different places, different countries, not just the appealing matter of Donbass and Crimean Peninsula, which shows simply how brutal simply the situation could be and how brutally human rights concerning the field of heritage, tangible and intangible, identity and language. Tatars in Crimean are now simply the victims of the oppression.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
It's very good to be brought back. Anita had already said that she hoped perhaps my mathematical side would come to the fore. The title at the door was, of course, Cases of, and the speakers were asked to deal with specific places and how they were related. But it is good to have a structure in which to put it, and good to be reminded that that's essential. May I say, I have for years, the one part of this, as I tried to indicate in what I said, was that one part of the issue of the human rights and legislation thing is planning. And again, in meetings throughout Europe, when we've had congresses and stuff, I've mentioned in the topic discussion, but the planning issue surely, and all the local people immediately jump up and say, yes, that's our big human, if you like now in modern terminology, human rights issue. And that's part of this bigger structure still, which, of course, Jacek's been talking to us about. And when I raise it in front of Michel Manier, who is the director who's been pushing with Snežka to do this year of cultural heritage, 2018, across the whole of Europe, may I say, not, of course, just the human rights. We're not only concerned with the human rights in the European Union, but across the whole of Europe and across the whole world, indeed, and how it fits. We talk about our neighbours globally as well as our neighbours over the European Union border. The reply is already, oh, that's a matter for subsidiarity. We can't be addressing planning. That's a local issue. But I think there's a lot to be said for collecting, for setting up something between Europa Nostra where either in the bigger context in which we have experts now to talk of the human rights issues, or in smaller contexts, part of it such as planning issues and how they involve it, that we should know in more detail the differences and how in this global work and how much it would help the people fighting the civil rights issues in Ukraine or wherever else, that there were all these comparative things available in order to be able to push things along.
if I might close the session with
No.
that. Oh, one more quick
Yes,
question,
please.
please.
Sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't
Sorry,
realize.
I don't want to take too
No,
much
please.
of your time. There are two things I would like to say.
Please.
I chose two things because
Yes,
there are
yes.
so many things to say. No, I wanted to thank you also for your intervention, and I wanted to flag one thing, maybe for Europa Nostra to think about, which we need at the UN, for example, which is that we know that there are many cases of contested heritage, of conflicts over heritage, of development plans threatening cultural heritage. Those cases simply do not reach, most of them, the UN, because the information is not sent to the UN. So what is needed are emblematic cases, whether development, intentional destruction, whatever, which you identify as problematic. And I'm sure the special rapporteur, I mean, she receives complaints from all over the world, but there is a complaint procedure. You can send directly to her a description of the case, saying what we understand is that this and this and this, these human rights are threatened and are jeopardized. And I think this is also a way to go forward, also because then what the special rapporteur does is that she writes back to the government asking questions about legislation, procedures and practices.
Who is this? I'm sorry, I didn't get you at the beginning.
Sorry?
Who do we write to? You said to?
To the special rapporteur on cultural rights, for example.
Special?
Rapporteur on cultural rights who was doing the video message this morning. She is a mechanism in herself. You also have the...
What if there's no government to write?
I'll come to Cyprus just afterwards.
Just do the brief things and people
No,
can talk to
the
you
second
afterwards,
mechanism
we
I
can
was raising
circulate
this
it.
morning is the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights.
Mm.
Most of the European governments, they show up before this committee every 4 or 5 years to explain what is their legislation and what is their policy regarding cultural rights, not only economic and social rights, but also cultural rights. And what NGOs do is that they send what we call alternative reports. And there is a clear opportunity to push forward the agenda of cultural heritage as a human right within the UN system. But the difficulty we have is that it's not a priority. I mean, in times of war, but in times of peace, let's be clear. So you have to push the agenda, and you have to make those mechanisms work more and more on that issue. And the other thing I wanted to, again, give you the procedure, whatever, if you want, can send a letter afterwards. It's very simple, but I know, as I was saying, we live in two different bubbles. We just need to work together. On Cyprus, I'm sorry because I had to go outside of the room for 2 minutes, so maybe you raised that issue, but in your description about this monastery, my question would be, what is the significance of this monastery for the people? And I understand that in the northern part of Cyprus, the people has been displaced, most probably. Are they still there or not? And what about the locals? I mean, what does it mean for them? And on Cyprus, I don't know if you're aware that there was a visit by the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights to Cyprus 2 years ago. Yes, yes. So just...
The problem is political before anything else, because the government of North Cyprus is not recognized by the international community.
I'm going to have to stop this. Well, this is one Europa Nostra is very much involved in, and I think this conversation between you should be importantly embedded in their discussion. We're already a bit late. I'm very sorry about that. But there was one issue you did raise which came up, has come up again and was certainly mentioned yesterday afternoon, namely the stealing of cultural valuable items, and they then appear in sale rooms of seemingly reputable, famous firms. And we had to the Europa Nostra UK meeting Lord Renfrew, Colin Renfrew, to talk to us. He's written a book about it and should point into it. But the fact is that reputable sale rooms don't check the provenance of where things come. And if that could be stopped, then a lot of lorries might not turn up at sites as they did in this site and make off with the mosaics. Anyway, I'm very sorry to cut this short. I was
grateful for an audience of a size I could never imagine, and just the case histories which we were asked to talk about has provoked discussion, which of course go way beyond, and things of human value to everybody in Finland and the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you.